It is not easy to speak after this very moving film. This is not the first time I've seen it, but every time I do, I'm deeply moved by this. It's very hard to find words. Franklin Littell, the Protestant churchman and theologian whom you saw, is a church historian who was deeply overwhelmed by the Holocaust, and his entire life has been dedicated to wrestling against secular anti-Semitism and Christian anti-Semitism, and he's published many books in this regard. The awful truth that Christians have to accept is that their church has a very ancient tradition of anti-Jewish attitudes, anti-Jewish symbols, anti-Jewish teaching that has profoundly influenced the course of Western civilization. And while it was not responsible for the biological anti-Semitism of the Nazis, it nonetheless created a culture in which there was very little resistance against the biological anti-Semitism of the Nazis. Why and where did all of this start? There were hints of it in this film. There was the early Christianity. The group of people who followed Jesus were all Jews. There was a conflict between the church and the synagogue. And in this conflict, the church wanted to show that the synagogue interprets the scriptures wrongly. The church wanted to show that in Jesus the scriptures were fulfilled. There were theological arguments between the two groups, and while at first such arguments looked perfectly harmless because they didn't really destroy anyone, when these arguments and these symbols and these accusations against Jews achieved great public and cultural power, and this was true after the Roman Empire became Christian, then these symbols of negation and these symbols and these words of accusation translated themselves into the civil exclusion of Jews and into laws against Jews and to the exclusion of Jews from the culture in general. And this trend in Christianity became stronger and stronger in the Middle Ages. And as we noticed here in this film, after the Reformation, it also was carried forward by the Protestant reformers. And so the movement for the recognition of Jews and assimilation really and honoring Jews only really began with the secular movement, that is, with the Enlightenment, with people who said religion is a blind force, it makes us blind, it makes us into haters, we close our mind, and so let's drop religion altogether and recognize our common humanity. And the churches at first were against the recognition of the common humanity, and only very gradually they learned. This is a very sad story. And it is enormously important for Christians not to forget this, not to remember the Holocaust, to be constantly aware of their burden of the past, and to ask themselves the question whether the manner in which they announce their religion today mediates friendship to Jews and friendship to members of other religions, or whether it still generates contempt and hatred. In this film, there is a few remarks that show that after the Holocaust, a movement began in the churches to change teaching and attitudes Franklin Littell himself was deeply involved in this movement. It already began before the Holocaust. In the film, at one time, when you see Franklin Littell teach in Jerusalem, there was on the blackboard the name Parks, James Parks. James Parks was an English theologian who wrote about Christian anti-Semitism in the 30s before the Holocaust. There were a number of Christian thinkers, Jacques Maritain among them, who in the 20s and 30s saw clearly the danger of anti-Semitism, the danger for Jews, and who recognized the Christian implication in this phenomenon. Now, after the war, and this movement became stronger, and you saw here that in all the churches, changes took place. In the Protestant churches, the Anglican Church, and in the Roman Catholic Church, which you saw portrayed in the Vatican Council. I must say that I was very much honored. I was a Catholic theologian present at the council. I was appointed at that time by Pope John the 23rd, and I had the great privilege of working in the secretariat, the ecclesiastical body, that produced the document on Catholic-Protestant friendship, which is called ecumenism, and that produced a document on Catholics' relations to Jews that rejects the prejudices of the past and argues that Catholics and Jews must be friends, that Catholics must respect Jewish religion. In fact, it says in the document that the Jews remains God's beloved people. In other words, in this document and in subsequent teaching, Christians and Jews, or Christianity and Judaism, are regarded as sister religions, both grounded in the biblical tradition. This movement took place at the highest level in documents, in the Catholic Church, in the Protestant churches, in the Anglican Church. But of course, this remains on the highest level in documents. And the question is, how much is this mediated in catechisms, in school books, in sermons? There are studies on this. Catechisms have been changed in this regard. Theological books have been changed. But the question is, how quickly is this assimilated? And therefore there continues today, in many Christian churches, a constant movement, a struggle against Christian anti-Semitism, against Christian symbols that despise Jews or negate Jewish religion and fail to honor Jews as brothers and sisters with whom we share a common biblical tradition. These are a few words I want to say, and I'm sure that there are things that you might want to say or ask. Is that all right? Mm-hmm. Very good. So don't be shy. Yes. Yes, I mean, this is a question about Christian attitudes towards Muslims and Christian attitude towards outsiders. I mean, the Bible is for Christian. Pardon? Oh, how Jews are regarded in the Islamic world. Yeah, I mean, there are studies on this. This is not my special field. But in the Islamic world, there was always an exception was made for Jews and for Christians. They were regarded as people of the book. And therefore, in Islamic civilizations, normally both Jews and Christians were allowed to live and to have their communities, even though there are instances in the history where Islam denied these rights and opposed Christians and opposed Jews. So this is a complex history. In other words, the attitude of Islam towards Jews was much more generous then the attitude of the Christian church in most centuries toward Jews. But I thought you asked the question that how do Christians look upon Islam and other religions? And why don't I mention just a word about this? I mean, the Bible is a difficult book, and it is full of ambiguities, because in the Bible there is the sense of the chosen people, first the chosen people of Israel, and later on in the New Testament the church, the believers in Jesus, regard themselves as the chosen ones. And then there's always the question, how do you relate yourself to the non-chosen ones? Who are the non-chosen ones? Who are the outsiders? And therefore the Bible, dealing with outsiders, is a highly ambiguous book. And so the native peoples of Canada, for instance, were outsiders. I'm invited to go to northern Manitoba tomorrow to spend about 4 or 5 days giving workshops in native communities, that is, native peoples, Christians, ask themselves, is it really possible to remain a Christian? Because the Christians who came here despised us and tried to convert us and tried to humiliate us and took our land away, and therefore is it possible for us to remain Christians? And so we have to admit that the Bible, dividing people up between the elect or the chosen and the non-chosen, is an ambiguous book, and it's only by reading certain texts of the Bible that we discover that we are all created by the same God, and that we are all alive by the same Spirit, and that there is a universalist promise in the Bible that we are meant to be a human family united by justice and by love and by peace. But in order to see this in the Bible, we have to work hard because we have to focus on these important passages where this vision is proclaimed. There are other texts of the Bible which are ambiguous because they teach us coldness, indifference in regard to outsiders.
You mentioned earlier you sort of were wondering to yourself whether how much is getting down to the local, on a local level, the idea of commonality of Jews and Christians. You wondered about that. So it leads me to ask, as far as chosenness goes, is there something that might make it difficult for people, let's say ordinary people, to keep a devoted feeling to their religion? They have to sacrifice the idea of being chosen, of being special, of being the most special religion. The other religion is okay, but my religion has got to be better.
Yes. I mean, these are, I don't know whether you heard the question. The question was, when the churches try to mediate this new attitude to Jews of dialogue, of friendship, of cooperation, and of respect, try to mediate this to ordinary believers, do they find this very difficult to accept? Difficult to accept because they still regard their own religion as superior and better, and therefore they find it very difficult to respect outsiders. Yes, I mean, I think there is. You touch a difficult point. I mean, theologians think about this. What does election mean? What does it mean to be chosen people? And I suppose you can think of being chosen, the chosen people, either Israel or the chosen people, the church. You can think of this as being some kind of superiority, some kind of anthropological superiority, and this would be misunderstanding the notion of the Scriptures. I think that in the Scriptures, chosenness meant that you are chosen to be a witness and a servant. For instance, if you imagine that you are invited to a huge party where there are 100 people for a great picnic, and the host comes to you and says, I will choose 5 of you to serve at table. There you have the notion of election, of choice, but it's not the choice that makes these 5 superior to others, but it makes them into servants, helping the others And so I think that the biblical notion of election, therefore, was not an attempt to raise people up, that they have the right to look down upon others, but it was a summons, a call to give witness and to serve humanity in its history.
So if I may add one more thing, it's almost the opposite notion of humility.
Mm-hmm. Mm-hmm.
Can you tell us about your own experience of growing up in a church in Germany, what that was like? Did you have a sense of anti-Semitism around you?
Well, I come from a Christian family that of Jewish background. That is, my grandparents, on my mother's side, there was a Jewish family that was Christian. So I grew up in a home that was Christian, but totally secular. That is, my relationship, I was taught Christian catechism, I was taught Christian religion in school, I participated in Christian holidays.
Was there anti-Semitism in that, even if it was kind of veiled?
Yeah. You see, the strange thing is, I'm glad you asked this question, the remarkable thing is that Christians, including myself, did not recognize the anti-Jewish symbols of the church. It didn't occur to them to think this was strange, or even to relate this to the contemporary issues. To give an example of this, there is in the liturgy of Holy Week, there is a wonderful text where Jesus speaks to his people and accuses them of not accepting him. Now, when I read this, and when Christians read this in the past, they applied this to themselves. They said, Jesus is speaking to us, and Jesus is accusing us of not being faithful, of not following him, of not following his example. And later on, when we woke up to the fact of Christian anti-Semitism, we reread the texts and we discovered that they were really awful because of their implications. So you remember in this film there was a reference to Doré, a French artist who decorated the Bible, and we had this Bible at home. And I remember reading this and looking at the pictures, and it never occurred to me that implicit in this was cultural religious prejudice. So I didn't realize this, even though I lived in Germany surrounded by Nazi anti-Semitism. So it was really a discovery that Christians made. There were always really anti-Semitic Christians, but the ordinary Christian discovered, to their great surprise, that the texts which they read and which they loved had in fact a terrible meaning and power to create prejudice and contempt in society.
Follow up a bit on the question at the answer you gave. Referring to the same Bible that was in the video, and the gentleman in the video said that he never had any encounters at all with Jews, that was from his own exposure. What about in your personal instance? Was there exposure to Jewish people, and did you see a kind of contradiction between illustrations and the people?
Yeah. The illustrations which you saw there was very special. I grew up very much in European art, and therefore one would have to look very hard for these negative images of Jews. If you look at the paintings of the Crucifixion of Rembrandt, or if you look at the paintings of what we call Old Testament, if you look at the depiction of Jews in European art, on the whole, they are not ugly figures at all. Rembrandt in particular, who went to the Jewish part of Amsterdam and depicted very beautiful Jews for his paintings. So the pictures which you saw there were altogether exceptions. And Doré, in his Doré depictions of Jews, there might have been occasionally faces that you saw there, but this was by no means the common representation. But there was the other side which you saw there. This is, of course, very much in Christian cathedrals, was an image of the synagogue and the image of the church. The one that you saw here comes from Strasbourg, from the Cathedral of Strasbourg, where you have one of the portals has two statues. One of them is a very beautiful woman with blinded, and this in the broken staff, and this is the synagogue. And on the other side, you have a woman with a crown on and a staff, and this is the church. So there were these symbols, were there. I think it was really a conversion after the Holocaust for Christians to realize that all this has had a cultural impact they didn't expect, and the good ones who were ready to be converted were horrified. They repented, and they tried everything to remove and transform these symbols.
I'm referring also more to your own personal instance, your own personal experiences of living.
My own, I'll tell you how I got into. I was
In relation to your upbringing.
yes. I was asked in I studied theology in Fribourg in Switzerland, and in 1955 or 56 I was asked to give 4 talks on the church and the Jews. I had never really thought about this before, and I began to read at that time. And I was profoundly shocked and scandalized because I had no idea of this. And I remember in particular, it was a book by an important French Jewish historian called Jules Isaac. Jules Isaac was a French historian, Jewish, whose wife and daughter had been transported to Auschwitz and disappeared. And he was away at the time from his home, and he hid in French homes, in small hotels. And while he was hiding, he began to write a book in which he examines the anti-Jewish distortions in the New Testament. And eventually, in the late 50s or middle 50s, his book, Jésus et Israël, came out. And I read the book, and it absolutely shattered me. I mean, I remember those years, it shattered me. I had no idea of this. And I then wrote a book myself and involved myself very much in this Christian movement against anti-Semitism and Christian anti-Semitism. And this was for me a dreadful and awful discovery that made me tremble, of which I was totally unaware.
One thing I was surprised about today, I very much appreciate how you say that, the church sort of created a culture in which anti-Semitism was accepted. But certainly, I'm surprised that you haven't said, but there's a big distinction between a tradition of Christian anti-Semitism and the systematic destruction that was, under the Nazi regime. So my question is, do you have problems with the film? Like you, I've seen the entire film. Do you, as a Christian theologian, look at the film and say, hey, this is maybe going a little too far in spots?
No, because after all, Franklin Littell here at the very beginning, because I know this literature so well, I hear this very, very carefully. Remember, at the beginning, Franklin Littell says it would be quite wrong to equate Christian anti-Judaism with Nazi anti-Semitism. He said other factors were involved. He didn't spell them out, but at the end they are spelled out because Nazi anti-Semitism was biological, and therefore it was aimed at all Jews, and therefore it was aimed at Christianity, at Jesus. And so at the end you saw this kind of play where the Gestapo comes, or the army comes, and arrests Jesus and Mary and Joseph. And therefore this shows that Nazi anti-Semitism was against Jews, all things Jewish, and therefore Christianity itself. And in fact, if you had looked at some of the pictures of the Stürmer here, you noticed in addition to caricaturing Jews, there were also pictures of nuns and priests, because in 1935 and 1936, when the Nazis discovered that the Catholic Church was not willing to support them as the majority Protestant church did at that time, there was this campaign against the church. And therefore I think the film then does show that there was a great difference. The church fathers, which were quoted, these terrible, terrible passage of the church fathers, or the terrible passage from Luther's, all this is unfortunately true. If you want a very good book on this by a Catholic theologian called Rosemary Ruther, Ruether, called Faith and Fratricide, in which she develops in detail this theological tradition of anti-Judaism, and she deals with the New Testament, she deals with the Church Fathers, she is a patristic scholar, she deals with the Middle Ages and eventually with modern times, and then she proposes of how Christians can reinterpret their faith. So what I've seen here makes me, of course, very unhappy and speechless in some way, but I couldn't say that this was not really acceptable from the point of view of Christian theology. Now, I haven't seen the other parts of this film, but this section here, I would say that.